I can't believe that in 2023 a major manufacturer would release a model that was not DCC ready. And yep, here I have one. Hi friends, my name's Steven and this is my channel Signal Up Productions, where I make videos all about trains. In today's video I'm going to explain why this model is not DCC ready and how to make the modifications to it so that we can install a loc sound decoder later. But before we get into that, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, and while you're at it, click that bell icon so you're notified every time I post a new video. Now let's tear into this model. One of the first things I do when I start a sound install is to get the speaker baffles glued together. Here I'm using the ESU speaker kits. They include a bunch of different baffle pieces to build a speaker box that will fit in a wide variety of spaces. Make sure that you don't make them too tall or they won't let the shell fit onto the frame. I use cheap tacky glue from the craft supply store to glue my baffles together. I squirt some out and use a toothpick or a micro brush to apply it evenly around the edges of the parts. Sandwich the baffle parts together, then wipe off the excess that oozes out. Then set them aside to dry. The customer wanted a loc sound 5 DCC decoder, but they wanted the ability to remove the decoder later and replace it easily in the future if they needed to. So I'm using an 8-pin socket from ESU, and I'll take the wires off later and solder those to the circuit board. To make the install easier, I lay out and organize all of my tools and supplies that I might need throughout the entire project. Get yourself some very small locking tweezers, some pliers, some sprue cutters, some wire strippers, flux, solder, and a good soldering iron, a file, a really sharp X-Acto knife, some screwdrivers, a pin vise with some drills, super glue, some DCC decoder wire, and some small heat shrink tubing. Now let's take the shell off. There are 4 locking tabs around the bottom of the shell. Gently slip your fingernails under the edge and pry out until the frame falls free. The light pipes for the headlights may fall out as well. That's normal, and they pop back in. Also, the ladders pop off from the frame. Just go ahead and take those off. There's 4 of them. Take them off and set them aside wherever you put the shell so you don't lose them. Put the shell in a safe place so it doesn't get damaged. The trucks just pull off the frame. They're held on by 2 small locking tabs. Gently pull and rock it side to side, and it'll eventually come off the frame. You'll see on the bottom of each truck there's an orientation arrow and a letter for the front and rear trucks marked with the F or the R. The arrow points towards the coupler pocket, so make sure that whenever you go to reattach the trucks, that you get the front truck towards the front of the frame, the rear truck towards the rear of the frame, and that the arrows are pointing towards the coupler boxes. You can see now why Kato did not make these DCC ready. Their design was to include the ability to pop the trucks off without wires or drive shafts getting in the way. On a DC only layout, the trucks themselves will even run by themselves without even being attached to the frame. It's funny and silly, but it serves no real purpose. The small motors cannot handle the full voltage that DCC has on the rails at all time, which is why it says very clearly in the instruction sheet not to place the engine on a DCC layout. The motors, because they are connected directly to the wheels, there's nothing to stop the voltage from getting straight to them, and even on a DCC layout, even running it as an analog engine, it will absolutely burn up the motors. The circuit board on top of the frame only serves to operate the lights. There's a rotary switch sticking out the top of the circuit board, which allows the modeler to set the locomotive headlights to be for the lead locomotive or for like a trailing engine. For DCC, we'll leave the switch in its default setting, The Kato instructions say that you should glue the switch in place to keep it from accidentally changing if you're going to modify the engine for DCC. I didn't feel that was a big concern, so I skipped that part. Since there's no wires coming from the track to the board, then back to the motors on the trucks, there's no way to make this engine DCC ready from the factory. So that's why we've got to modify it to make it work with a decoder. Use a screwdriver and remove the 2 black screws on top of the circuit board. The metal frame is part of the power pickup that feeds the lights. This means that the board already has track power available. It's just a matter of cutting the traces on the board, adding a jumper, and running wires from the motors up to the circuit board. I use a sharp X-Acto knife to cut the traces, but a file will work also. The Kato instructions say you can use a Dremel tool. I don't know that I would recommend that. Refer to the Kato guide as to where to cut the board. With the traces cut, I'll cut wires off the 8-pin socket, then solder it on top of the circuit board. After I get that soldered on the board, I'm going to use some flush cutters to nip off the ends of the socket pins from the underside of the circuit board. The wires from the motor are attached to some bronze wipers that are inserted to the end of the truck frame. These simply pull out of the truck. Unsolder the wires and discard the wipers. The wires on the motor are red and black from the factory, and they're very short. I use some small decoder wire to extend the length to reach the circuit board on top of the frame. To stay consistent, I went ahead and used the same color that was already on the motors. So I just used red and black. Normal DCC standard for motor wiring would be orange and gray. So you can use whatever you wish in your case. If you want to use orange and gray from the motor to the circuit board, that's fine. But to be consistent, I just stuck with red and black. Twist the wires of the same color together, either with your finger if they're small enough, or if you're like me and you've got big, giant fingers that can't grip the wire that small, then just use a small pair of locking tweezers and then twirl that in your hand to twist the wires together. Solder these connections, then cover it with some heat shrink tubing. To help reinforce the small wires, I superglued the heat shrink tubing to the ends of the truck frames. There is a small dimple molded into the plastic spacer for the engine's frame. Drill a 1/16 inch hole, and then that will be used to accommodate the wires coming from the motor. Do this for both the front and the rear trucks. The trucks are only held on the frame with some really small locking tabs, and we were finding that they would pop off really easy. I was afraid that someone would be carrying the engine and the trucks would pop off and just be dangling from the new motor wires that we installed. I didn't want to risk those wires getting damaged in that kind of scenario, so I'm going to add some screws to the top of the trucks to hold them to the engine frame. There is a clip on top of the truck frame that has an alignment pin that goes into a hole in the engine frame. I take this clip off the truck, then I drill and tap a hole for a 256 screw, then replace the clip back on the truck. Put the truck back on the frame. You'll see that one truck pin is closer to the metal frame than the other. So for one truck, I used a metal screw, but for the other one, I used a plastic one to avoid the risk of shorting out the frame. I use some KD truck washers to keep the truck pins from pulling out of the frame. Be sure not to tighten the screws down too much so the trucks can still pivot freely. attach the motor wires to the 2 pads on the bottom of the circuit board. Once all of the connections are made to the bottom of the board, you can either paint a coat of nail polish or use some kind of electrical tape to prevent any possible shorts. Take note that the wires from each of the motors cross-connect at the circuit board. The red wire from one motor connects to the black wire of the other, and then to the same solder pad on the board. With the decoder installed, I could now attach the speakers. Since there are 2 speakers, I wired them in parallel. There's not a whole lot of room under the shell for extra wires. The holes in the frame that the speakers set into double as the spot where the light pipe frame rides in. Be sure to route the speaker wires out the side of the frame. There should be a notch already there for that. With all that done, I was able to write the sound file from the ESU website using the Loc programmer. In this case, it took about 45 minutes. Then I programmed the head and rear lights to function how the customer wanted, and now this engine is ready for service. At this point, I thought I was about done and ready to put the shell back on. Unfortunately, the 8-pin socket that I had was a little too tall and did not allow the shell to sit back all the way down onto the frame. So I had to use a Dremel tool with a flex shaft and a drill bit to carve out part of the shell that was causing the interference. Don't forget to replace the 4 stepladders back onto the frame before putting the shell back on. I made this modification on several other Kato P42s after I made this video. On those models, I hardwired the decoder to the circuit boards. This meant that I did not need to drill out the shell, but it also means that if someone wants to upgrade those other models to sound someday in the future, they'll actually have to unsolder the old decoder in order to do that. Kato is a great company, and they make some of the smoothest running locomotives. This model is still a good choice. I just wish they would have made it a little more DCC friendly out of the box. I'll include a link to the Kato instructions from their website in the description down below. Have you ever had a difficult DCC installation? Leave a story in the comment section down below, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.